Hi, and welcome to this webinar from RPI Consultants. My name is Jeff House. I'm one of the senior consultants with RPI. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about GHR and S3 interfaces, your S3 system, your legacy Lawson system, and how data is going to move from that into your brand new Cloud Suite Global HR system or GHR system, and then also talk about the interfaces that move between GHR and S3. Our agenda today is we're going to go over we're going to have a brief overview of what these interfaces are, interfaces going from S3 to GHR. We're going to talk about also interfaces that go from GHR to S3. We'll talk about how they work. We're going to go over some of the maintenance that you have to do with them. And then we'll also talk about ways that you can possibly optimize these interfaces to make them run a little bit more smoothly. So we know that we have interfaces between multiple systems. We have our accounting information that's stored in our legacy Lawson system. These are things like your accounting units, your companies, your accounts, your account to account. Maybe your finances are still in S3, or maybe you're just using your S3 system for payroll. But accounting information still resides within S3 for many people, unless you're moving to Cloud Suite Financials, but we're going to focus exclusively on the legacy Lawson system. We've got to get this accounting information from our Lawson system into GHR and keep those systems in sync. Now, from the global HR side, that's where all of our employees reside. Everything that happens with the employee is residing now in GHR. But if we're paying the people out of legacy Lawson, we have to have all of the updates for the employee in the legacy Lawson system, and we have to keep that data current and in sync so our payrolls are going to process efficiently. So first, let's talk a little bit about the accounting information. This is data that's flowing from the Lawson S3 system into global HR. Highlighted are a few of the main interfaces. There's also things dealing with activities, account categories, and anything that's in the AC system code. But these are the primary ones that you're going to have to pass across. Most likely, your chart or your currency is not going to change, but your accounting information and your accounts certainly do as you update them. Maybe it's an inactivate or you activate certain accounts. Maybe you added a new account or accounting unit. These changes are going to have to flow over from Lawson to GHR. The data is going to be pulled from GHR. It's going to query the S3 system and then incorporate the changes into GHR for you. Now on the flip side, let's talk a little bit about our employee data and all the things that make up an employee. Now the order that we have these listed out here on the employee data that is critical. So, and if you think about it, it makes sense. So if I'm an employee, I have a position. Tied to my position is a job, and then tied to my job is a supervisor. So if the supervisor doesn't exist, then we can't add that supervisor to the position. If the job doesn't exist, we can't add the job to the position. So therefore, our exports, so we make a change to a supervisor, we make a change to a job, we make a change to a position, and we make a change to our employee. We have to get all of those records uniquely from GHR over into S3. So the order goes supervisor, job, position, employee. Now another thing is we've all created user fields in S3, and most people have groaned when they've had to create user fields over there before. User fields are much more accommodating in the global HR system. But in order to get those user fields over to the S3 system, we have to take some care in our GHR system to make sure that the data is going to flow properly. We can create a user field on any business class within GHR very easily. But if we want to take that user field data and get it over into S3, maybe it's used in an absence management group or a payroll group, that would be about some of the only reasons that you would have to do this. We also have to make sure that that user field exists on the export business class and then also on the export form. And if you think about it, I'm an employee, you make a change to me in GHR, my data resides in GHR. It's the master system of record. But if I'm going to export it out, that's going to go into a staging area, and that is the employee export business class. So the user field must exist there. Now I'm also going to have to put this on a form. Maybe I'm going to edit it before I send it down. Most times you don't, but occasionally you do. So therefore, the user field also has to be present on the form. Most of these interfaces are delivered with the application, and then you have the ability to modify them if you need to. They're all in IPA, and they're driven from the GHR server, so they can be put on a scheduler or they can be run on demand as you wish. Here's an example of the delivered interface flow. This is actually the employee export. And notice it's a pretty straightforward flow. It's just going to query the employee export business class, look for any data that hasn't been sent over to S3 before, and then if there are changes to it, then it's going to try to write a transaction out to our Lawson S3 system in a field called LT11, or a form called LT11, which I'll explain here in just a little bit, but that's our staging area over in S3. Employee export is our staging area in GHR, LT11.1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Several of the other the other subscreens in S3 are where we stage data before it actually goes to your HR11. So if we're going from GHR to Lawson, we have the export business classes: employee export, supervisor export, job export, position export. Those are all going to go into their own individual flows. They'll be called like HRM employee export, HRM job export, and so on. There's a cross-reference table too, and we'll explain that in a little bit more detail later. But when you think about it, some of the data that we have in GHR is probably going to be different, more robust. We're going to have a lot more flexibility within GHR, and we need to translate that into something that our S3 system is still going to understand. Cross-reference table is how we do that. It's our map between the two systems. Once everything goes through these export flows, we're going to see the data come across at the LT11 screen, where we can modify it in a staging area before we actually make it live. And how do we make it live? We have to run a job LT111 that is going to process all of these changes. Here's a brief look at what the employee export screen looks like from GHR. So I've made a change to an employee, some of the employees that you see here on this screen, and GHR has automatically created these export records. It's all set up through the interface setup. There are a few things that you have to set up on the back end, but it's not too difficult to get this working. From here, I can export the records out and send them. Each one of them will be their own individual work unit. So if you make a change on me as an employee, I'm going to have my own work unit for that change. And if you make a change on my coworker is going to have his or her own work unit as well. Each one of these records also has a form associated with it. And on the form, notice that there are some user fields on this form. And as I mentioned just a little bit ago, they have to be on this form in order for the export to work properly and for the data to come across properly. Now, user fields, if they're for GHR exclusively, I have something that might be used in GHR benefits that's really not necessary over in S3. There's no need for me to interface all of that data that is unnecessary. S3 just needs to know about the things that are important to S3, paying people, absence management, or whatever it is that you're still doing over in S3. But GHR is, of course, the system of record, and we can do a lot more things with user fields there. The cross-reference codes are mapped between systems by that cross-reference table. It's all in the process server administrator and configuration and cross-reference. Lots of these are delivered for you. You'll see them as you go into the cross-reference on your GHR IPA implementation. and then it's up to you to maintain the data. If there's no mapping required, there is a field on the cross-reference tape or the cross-reference screens that tell you that you don't have to use mapping, and then it will just use the data as is. That means that it exists in GHR exactly as it exists in S3. So there's a whole bunch here. And notice on this one, this is looking at the standard fields. So now, standard fields are things like your badge code or your union code. Maybe you're an organization that does not have unions, and you've decided to make union code your lunch balance. You could do that, and maybe you did that in S3 and you need to interface it a certain way. So here what you would do is you would map that user field within GHR to whatever it is that you have on the union code, the data that you want to pass down. It's not a user field in S3, but it is a user field in GHR, and this particular cross-reference on the standard fields is going to accomplish that for you. Now, if you have true user fields, notice there is a user field mapping, and here you have to map the named user field in GHR to the field key that is in S3. To find that, you can query the system. There's numerous ways that you can do it, but you must know the exact number of the user field that exists in S3 that you want updated. Status codes are huge. Notice in GHR, we have 3 components that make up an employee status. We have a relationship to organization, a relationship status, and a work type. The 3 of those things equate to one 2-letter code or 2-digit code in S3. So notice on this one, there's a lot of things that map to PT or part-time, a lot of things that are going to map to AF. However it is that you've set up your status codes, there's no need to recreate all of your status codes in S3. You might as well keep them the way they are. And then use your more robust GHR system to have the combination of these things. But then you do have to maintain them here. So if you do add any new relationship to organizations, relationship status, work types in GHR, you're going to have to place them here in the cross-reference table. And if you create any new status codes in S3 for whatever reason, then you'll also need to map the appropriate GHR combo to it. Now, a little bit about the LT11 screen. So we saw in that screenshot of the flow earlier that for every export record that we find, we're going to create an LT11 record. That's our staging area prior to running to HR11. Now, once we are satisfied with that, and we may want to run this on a batch scheduler too, we have to run the LT111 to make these records updated. So one thing you can do is possibly have an LT111, a multi-step job where you run them in that exact order: supervisor, job, position, employee. Haven't come up with a good acronym for it yet, eventually. But you can set it up for your organizations, put it on a scheduler through RecDef. You could also schedule it with your your S3 version of IPA. However it is that you like to schedule your jobs, they're all acceptable. Or you could run them manually if you're a real go-getter. Now, here's a little bit about the LT11.1. A few key fields to notice on here are those ones that are up top, talking about the date stamp, the time stamp, and the object ID. That's a good way to relate it back to your employee export over in GHR, because you might have several employee exports for me, the employee, because stuff changes all the time with employees. So this gives you that unique number. In case there's an error on the S3 side, you might have to go backwards and troubleshoot it within GHR to see exactly what happened. Or it could be an error on the S3 side as well. But the LT11.1 screen is your base to find out all of these pieces of data. If you need to change something on the screen, probably not a good idea, but it is available if you need to. Now, as you process your employee information, you can decide whether you want to create personnel actions for these employees or not. Now, one school of thought says, I want to keep PA 52 actions within my system. Maybe I have some reports built around these things and I'm not ready to rewrite them yet because they are incorporating HR and payroll data. That might be a legitimate case to continue using personnel actions. Just remember that you do have a little bit more setup required and maybe a little bit more maintenance to make this happen. If you don't have any reporting requirements and things like that, then you probably want to eliminate your PA52s and just let the employees process. Remember, think of your S3 system processing payroll as a payroll system. Your employee master is GHR. That's where your history resides. That's where you're going to be doing your research. Now, how do you want to get these transactions from GHR over to S3? You do have the ability in the interface setup to schedule them immediately. You make a change to me, the employee, it immediately goes and exports that record out. That is perfectly acceptable. Or you may want to append all of those actions and then schedule them for a couple times a day or maybe once a day, whatever works for you. And then you would send them in batch. So they would go to LT11. Now for your schedule, and think about it, every payroll person in this world not only has a big red book of everything that they do step by step, and God forbid they lose it, but every payroll person is also very sensitive about their data and when employees are getting updated, especially while they're processing payroll. Do we want to have these employee changes processed? Probably not. But think about in GHR, I can process my employees. I can export those records over into S3 and they can sit in the staging table and wait. They don't have to be processed. HR could perhaps continue to do their work while payroll is continuing to do their work and then turn the flag on and off later. Also, there are deduction exports, which we didn't mention earlier, but you think about it, if you're doing benefits in GHR, benefits of course have deductions associated with them. An employee changes benefit, I'm going to have changes to deduction. Now, if I also have a change to an employee, maybe I went from full-time to part-time, that also triggered a benefit change. I really need to make sure that my employee change is valid over an S3 before my deduction change. So keep that in mind as you're scheduling these things, that you don't want to do deduction. You may not want to do deduction immediately after employee. You might want to stagger those a little bit later. Another big thing, set up a service account. If you schedule any of these jobs as Jeff House, it's always going to run at Jeff House. He's not permanent, but a service account most likely is. Now, all of these flows are delivered to you in a form by Infor. You're welcome to modify them if you want to. You are not allowed to modify Infor's delivered flows because in a future update, Infor is going to push up perhaps a new version of their flow. If you do decide to customize, just keep in mind that these automatic changes from version upgrades are not going to be applied to your custom flows. You're going to have to watch the release notes or just read in the flow to find out what has changed and figure out if you need to incorporate those features into your flow. Maybe it was something for an international customer and you don't have to worry about people in India. And that was the change to the flow. That's a realistic scenario. But if it was something where the application has changed, you're going to have to incorporate that into your modified flow. So that's just a brief introduction and overview about your interfaces going from GHR to S3 and from S3 to GHR. Your S3 to GHR interfaces are generally your accounting interfaces. You can also customize those if you need to maybe optimize them a little more. Your GHR to S3 is everything dealing with the employee. You have deductions, you have various other things, and remember all of those go into staging tables in both GHR and in S3, and then you're welcome to schedule around those to whatever works for your organization. And keep a lookout on this channel for any future webinars. This was an introductory course. Maybe you'll see something again on a more advanced course with interfaces. We can do that some other time. If you have any requests for webinars, then please shoot us an email, and we will certainly try to incorporate that in future changes. And we thank you so much for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar.